Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, my name is Aisha Al-Khater. I am the director of the Museum of Islamic Art, Qatar. I would like to welcome you all firstly to Qatar and then to the museum for the occasion of the 4th Biennial Hamad bin Khalifa Symposium on Islamic Art. Virginia Commonwealth University Qatar is the flagship university at Qatar Foundation's education city. The Museum of Islamic Art is the flagship museum of the Qatar Museums Authority. Today's occasion celebrates the combined efforts of both institutions and endorses the vision of His Highness, the Emir of Qatar, Sheikh Hamad bin Khalifa Al Thani, to mold the state of Qatar into a capital of culture. We are honored here today to host some of the world's most distinguished scholars in the field of Islamic art. Over the next 2 days, we will be joined by academics, educators, students, and art lovers to hear the scholars speak about the beautiful objects of this museum. I would like to take this opportunity to thank His Highness Sheikh Hamad bin Khalifa Al Thani and Your Excellency for this wonderful occasion, Sheila Blair and Jonathan Bloom, the organizers of the symposium, and the dedicated staff of Virginia Commonwealth University and the Museum of Islamic Art for ensuring this symposium is a success. I would like to introduce Her Excellency Sheikha Al-Mayasa bint Hamad Al Thani, Chairperson of the Qatar Museums Authority, who will inaugurate the symposium. Thank you.
Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the 4th Biennale Hamad bin Khalifa Symposium on Islamic Art. This year's program is titled, God is Beautiful, He Loves Beauty, the Object in Islamic Art and Culture. I am humbled to welcome such a high caliber of experts from different parts of the world connected with one interest, that is to champion the study of Islamic art and continue to delve in understanding its visual richness beyond the object. The artistic statement, whether in the context of this magnificent Islamic building built by IMP or others, symbolizes something more significant, be it culture, politics, geography, or economics. The point is, we must understand our past within its context to understand where the future is taking us. Modernization does not come at the extent of our own identity or culture voice. It is in the honor of my father that people from around the globe have come to Qatar for this symposium. He is a great champion of learning. His restless curiosity is a model to other leaders in the world that through communication, exchange of ideas, and creativity, peace can be achieved among all people. His energy is infectious, resulting in a positive domino effect region-wide, making us work 24 hours in the day. Both my mother and father have provided first-class education, not only as a priority, but also a birthright, not only for the Qatari people, but for the Arab world and beyond. Education City, alongside other local universities, such as Qatar University, has established Doha as a capital for education of people from all walks of life. The appreciation of Islamic art has continued for more than 14 centuries, yet the formal study and teaching about it has been growing for just over 100 years. While the academic community's interest in Islamic art has increased recently, so too have museums expanded their collections and activities for public enjoyment of the art of Muslim cultures around the world. The Museum of Islamic Art, in which we host this symposium, is a single accomplishment symbolizing Qatar's appreciation for our cultural heritage, among others. We are fortunate that the works of art on display here in the museum are among the finest in any collection. Each object tells a unique story. Each work of art represents our traditions, and each demonstrates the exceptional craftsmanship of its creator and the love with which it was made. Our mission is to provide access to these great works of art in the most inspiring context and by the most accessible means. With respect to this symposium, our responsibility is to enable you to share your love of these beautiful objects to others. By combining all of our efforts, our museums, the academic institutions in Qatar, our connections with scholars and institutions around the globe, we will invigorate appreciation and respect for the contributions of the people living under the banner of Islam. You will meet here important contributions to knowledge about Islamic art and share experiences that should be mutually fulfilling. Perhaps you will establish relationships that will last over the years, forming important bonds that extend your discoveries beyond boundaries. Furthermore, the strong force of social media that has changed the face of the Arab world in the last months will also be part of the Islamic Art Doha website. All lectures from past, present, and future lectures of the Hamad bin Khalifa Symposia will be found in podcast form. Anywhere in the world, anyone with access to a computer can have access to our archives of lectures and presentations. All of us here today have had our lives enriched by all that is beautiful, and God is beautiful. He loves beauty. In addition to their highnesses, I would like to thank all those who have made this symposium possible. The Board of Qatar Foundation for its continued support of this and other projects, Dean Alison Van Stone and the staff of Virginia Commonwealth University in America, and here in Doha who have worked so hard to arrange with the symposium. The organizers of the Hamad bin Khalifa Symposia, Dr. Sheila S. Blair and Jonathan M. Bloom, for bringing together this remarkable group of speakers who will present their fascinating and inspiring papers over the coming days. We are privileged by their continuing commitment to organize these events for us here in Qatar and elsewhere. I also wish to take this occasion to acknowledge the director of the Museum of Islamic Art, Ms. Aisha Al-Khatar, and her superb team for the time, energy, and dedication they have given to host this event. And thanks to the staff of the Qatar Museums Authority for their logistical support of this symposium. I now declare this fourth symposium open and welcome you to enjoy the presentations and events. I ask you all to join me in greeting our first speaker, Paul Goldberger, the outstanding author who will discuss the museum building as a work of Islamic art.
Thank you, Your Excellency. Your Excellency, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, I am pleased to welcome you to the 4th Biennial Hamad bin Khalifa Symposium on Islamic Art. The symposium is a highly successful collaboration between our esteemed Hamad bin Khalifa Endowed Co-Chairs of Islamic Art, Sheila Blair and Jonathan Bloom, Virginia Commonwealth University School of the Arts, VCU Qatar, and of course our gracious host for this year, the Museum of Islamic Art. We are delighted to co-host the symposium once again in Doha, a city that is rapidly developing an impressive cultural life and legacy. We are in the midst of a true renaissance, and there is no better place that I could imagine for this symposium than this magnificent building with its extraordinary collection. VCU Qatar strives to develop sustainable partnerships that enhance the educational, economic, and cultural vitality of Qatar. We are fortunate to collaborate with the Museum of Islamic Art and are committed to our partnership with the Qatar Museums Authority to support the growth, the distribution, and the appreciation of Islamic art and culture. I would like to recognize and thank His Highness Sheikh Hamad bin Khalifa Al Thani for making this symposium possible, the Qatar Foundation for 14 years of partnership with VCU, Her Highness Sheikh Amoza bint Nasser for her visionary leadership, and Dr. Abdullah Al Thani for his unwavering support and guidance. My special thanks go to Her Excellency Sheikha Al Maasa, whose vision and commitment towards the arts has made our gathering here today possible. On behalf of VCU Qatar, I would like to thank all of you for joining us and for contributing to the rich infrastructure for our future studies of Islamic art and culture. We hope that you will find the symposium both stimulating and valuable, and also enjoy the architectural splendor of the Museum of Islamic Art and Doha. Thank you. And please join me in welcoming Joe Seipel, Dean of the VCU School of the Arts.
Your Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the 4th Biennial Hamad bin Khalifa Symposium on Islamic Art. I'm pleased to introduce to you this evening our Hamad bin Khalifa Endowed Co-Chairs of Islamic Art, Dr. Sheila Blair and Dr. Jonathan Bloom, who have been leading this symposium since its inception in 2004. A wife and husband team, they are the authors of well over a dozen books and hundreds of articles on all aspects of Islamic art and architecture, including Rivers of Paradise, Water in the Islamic Art and Culture, and Diverse Are Their Hues, Color in Islamic Art and Culture, the beautiful volumes of papers from these previous symposia. Dr. Blair's latest book is Islamic Calligraphy, a survey of the quintessential form of Islamic art, and Dr. Bloom's latest book is Arts of the City Victorious, the first full-length study of the art and architecture of the Fatimid dynasty of North Africa and Egypt. Also holders of the Norma Jean Calderwood University Professorship of Islamic and Asian Art at Boston College, they have recently edited the 3-volume Grove Encyclopedia of Islamic Art and Architecture, published by Oxford University Press in 2009, and the winner of the 2010 Book of the Year Prize from the Islamic Republic of Iran. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Dr. Sheila Blair and Jonathan Bloom.
Hello, I'm Sheila Blair.
And I'm Jonathan Bloom.
In case you missed it. And it's our pleasure as the joint holders of the Hamad bin Khalifa Endowed Chair at Virginia Commonwealth University to welcome you all here. We're thrilled. It's wonderful to see that this event has attracted such a devoted and faithful following. And we too had written out our thanks to everybody, but I think that we've thanked the Qatar Foundation and Virginia Commonwealth University, both here and there, the Qatar Museum Authority, and the Museum of Islamic Art already. I would just like to add quickly one thanks, and that is to the staff at these various institutions who have been working so hard behind the scenes and whose contribution often does not get recognized. And it is thanks to them that this event will run so smoothly. So thank you all.
It's our very great honor tonight to introduce our keynote speaker, Paul Goldberger, who holds the Joseph Urban Chair in Design and Architecture at the New School in New York City and is architecture critic for the New Yorker magazine. In organizing these symposia, we seek to make the latest and most interesting scholarship in the growing field of Islamic art available and accessible to the widest audience, whether through this symposium, its publication on the web, or in the beautiful books that are produced from it. This time, we focus on the object. In other words, we seek to show how works of art can open windows into the multifaceted worlds of Islam, past and present. For this event, our many speakers will explore great works of art collected in this magnificent building. And so it is suitable for us to begin this symposium with an investigation of the extraordinary structure in which we are now gathered. We could imagine no greater, more appropriate guide to this endeavor than Paul Goldberger, the Pulitzer Prize-winning author who, in his long and fruitful career, has provided insightful criticism of the built environment to a generation of readers. Author of several books and winner of many awards, he has the gift to help us see and understand what is significant and meaningful about the places in which we live and work. Please join us in welcoming Paul Goldberger, who will speak tonight on Islamic architecture, modernism, and IMP, the challenge of the Museum of Islamic Art.
Good evening. Your Excellency, distinguished guests, and colleagues. I'm honored to be here to open this gathering of scholars, and deeply grateful to Jonathan Bloom and Sheila Baer for extending this invitation, and to the museum and its staff for so generously hosting all of us here in these extraordinary surroundings. It's a particular pleasure to begin the proceedings by discussing what must surely be the largest object to be studied in the history of this symposium, the remarkable building within which we're meeting. Now, it isn't common practice, of course, for the building in which a talk is given to be the subject. I'm tempted to say, in lieu of showing slides, look about you. I will not say that, since at least much of what I have to talk about is not visible from where we sit right now. It's equally unusual for the container, rather than the objects held within it, to be the subject of analysis at a symposium of this sort. Usually, the objects contained are the focus of attention, and the container is sort of a neutral presence. But this, as we all know, is no ordinary container. It is both an important work of architecture on its own terms and one designed very much with the meaning of the objects it holds in mind. So it makes absolute sense to begin these several days of conversation with a look at this building in the hope that it will set a context for the rest of our discussions and also offer some perspective that may be useful with other subjects in the coming days. Let me begin with a very brief word about the nature of architecture and how it differs from other subjects of inquiry in the realm of art history. Architecture can, indeed it must, be considered from multiple standpoints. It's an aesthetic object, and as such, it is expected to bring beauty. In this, of course, it has much in common with the other objects that this symposium will address. But architecture is also a practical object in that it serves a need and is expected to bring each of us ease of use, which is to say it has to function well. In this sense, too, it has something in common with at least some of the objects that will be considered over the next 2 days. And architecture as a physical object is expected to follow the laws of engineering, which is to say, it has to stand up. Here it stands apart from other aesthetic objects and from most other practical objects as well. This tripartite view of architecture, which has its roots in Vitruvius's never-surpassed definition of architecture as commodity, firmness, and delight, means that no building's story is ever a single narrative. It is inevitably multiple narratives braided together so tightly that none can be considered on its own. And I should say that beauty, functionality, and structural quality are not in themselves the only narratives. The complexity of discussion of a majestic and ambitious public building like this one almost invariably involves far more than just the aesthetic, the practical, and the physical. We might also say that any building, and surely this one, is a physical object within a larger set of adjacent objects. It must be considered within its context, in other words. in connection to those other buildings that are around it if it is urban, in connection to its natural setting if it is not. And every now and then, we encounter a building that, like this one, is sited in such a way as to exist simultaneously in an urban and a natural context. But then there's another meaning of context too, a less physical one. Every building, and surely this one, is also a political object with a particular meaning for its culture and for other cultures. So we cannot fully separate out any of these aspects of a building's meaning. They are all intertwined, as I've said. But I do think it's possible to say that there are three primary narratives for the Museum of Islamic Art, three modes, if you will, for analysis of this building, all of which themselves embrace aspects of the aesthetic, the practical, and the structural. All three of these modes, these ways of analyzing the building, are essential to any understanding of I.M. Pei's work here. They are, first, to consider the Museum of Islamic Art within the rich history of the museum in contemporary culture. Itself, of course, a compelling narrative of its own, and one within which this museum aspires to play an important part. Second, I think it's essential to analyze the Museum of Islamic Art as a key event, indeed, in some ways, perhaps the ultimate moment within the career of I.M. Pei, one of the central figures of architecture of the last 60 years. And then third, closely connected to these other narratives, but also a narrative of its own, we must look at the Museum of Islamic Art in the context of the attempts of so many architects in so many different places to evolve a contemporary expression of Islamic architecture over the last generation. And to these three primary narratives, we might even add a fourth, which is the story of Qatar itself and Doha, and the ambitious attempt to establish within this city both a vibrant cultural life and a meaningful urbanism. So there is no shortage of ways in which to view this building and I.M. Pei's and Qatar's intentions in bringing it into existence. I should say again that what I've called contexts or narratives are not parallel or discrete stories, but are inextricably intertwined and interconnected. It's impossible to tell the story of the expansion of the museum in our time without tying it also to the career of I.M. Pei, who has produced, as we'll see, several of the key museum buildings of the last generation. It's equally impossible to discuss the ambitions of Qatar without looking into this broader history of the museum, since much of the story of the growth of museums in our time is that of places, whether they're the provincial cities of Europe, medium-sized cities in the United States, private corporations in Asia, or the growing nations of the Middle East, observing the extent to which architecturally innovative museums have become symbols of other places, signaling their ambitions to the world. And even the quest in this particular design to find a common ground between traditional elements of Islamic architecture and modern architecture, a quest that I.M. Pei has emphasized greatly in his own discussions about the building, is really part of a larger dialogue between Islamic and Western modern architecture, a dialogue very much furthered by the initiatives of the Aga Khan Foundation that precedes this building by many years and will continue long beyond the day that this building is new. So let me start with a few more words on the history of the museum in the last few years. It's not news to say that we live in an age of museums, an age in which cities and nations across the world have come to view the museum as one of the most potent, perhaps the most potent, way in which to draw tourists and support a local economy. A more educated, more visually literate public has come to view the museum not as the province of the elite, but as a democratic right. More important still, the museum has become the calling card, the identifiable landmark in many cities, many of which you see on the screen now. The building that, to use an American colloquialism, puts a place on the map. Once it was the cathedral. I'm hardly the first person to observe that the art museum has come in many places, at least in American and European cities, to serve as a kind of secular cathedral, as the special building that everyone knows and that marks any particular city as distinctive. Of course, you can't be distinctive if you have the same art museum as the next city, any more than you could have been distinctive in the Middle Ages if you had the same cathedral. So the other characteristic of this last generation has been a desire that our museums have a more conspicuous architectural presence, and that we think of them not just as containers for works of art, but as works of art in themselves. Symbolically, at least, this view began in our time with Frank Lloyd Wright's Guggenheim Museum in New York, completed 52 years ago. And for all 52 of those years, at least as much of an attraction in New York City than any painting in its collection. In the years immediately following the Guggenheim, and maybe in some ways in reaction to it, the modernist preference for showing art in simple, straightforward, orthogonal white rooms remained fairly common, derived in part from the belief that these places were neutral environments that deferred entirely to art. That was something of a fallacy, of course, since no space is truly neutral, and white boxy rooms are themselves a potent architectural statement. But there were many, many other ways of making museums. The 1970s brought two of the greatest museum projects by Louis Kahn, the Kimball in Fort Worth and the Yale Center for British Art in New Haven, both magnificent, brooding buildings that reinterpreted the modern aesthetic as something no longer light but heavy, solid, almost primal. At the same time, Richard Meyer was beginning an ambitious career as a museum architect by reinterpreting modernism in a very different way, as light and picturesque, almost romantic, and not at all neutral. I think it's fair to say that as museums became a more important architectural commission, the counter-reaction to the presumed neutrality of the simple modern box grew, driven in part by the democratization of art, making museums more popular, as well as by the gradual but steadily mounting doubts among architects and clients that orthodox modernism of the international style, that is, the simple modernist box, could provide the degree of popular attraction that they sought. Surely Renzo Piano and Richard Rogers, in their competition-winning entry for the Centre Pompidou in Paris, completed in 1977, had a new model in mind. It was a model that somewhat disingenuously pretended to neutrality by virtue of its flexible and changeable interiors. But it was not, of course, neutral at all. It was a powerful statement, as powerful in its way as the Guggenheim had been. Piano and Rogers turned modernism into hypermodernism, exaggerating functional elements and turning them into what, for all intents and purposes, was decoration. Most importantly, the Pompidou inaugurated a vast new wave of highly expressionist, distinctive museums, including several by I.M. Pei himself, about which I'll talk in a few moments. Now, my point is not to review every significant museum of the last generation. If I did, we would be here all evening, and this would not be a pre-dinner talk, but a pre-breakfast one. But we should point out that all through the last 2 decades of the 20th century, the growth of the museum as a vehicle for architectural expression has seemed to expand exponentially. Renzo Piano built and continues to build museums at an astonishingly rapid rate, and many of them, including the Menil collection in Houston, or the Byler in Basel, or the recent modern wing of the Art Institute of Chicago, are important further stages in the quest to find a modernist expression that is at once light and substantial, and a vivid but not too assertive presence. And now, if we want to set the work of I.M. Pei into the context of his peers, as we will, it would be wrong not to mention 2 other examples quickly of architects who chose very different routes to break away from orthodox modernism. James Sterling, whose Neue Staatsgalerie in Stuttgart, completed in 1985, is perhaps the greatest postmodern museum ever built, an intense, extreme play on historical form that is almost an inversion of classicism. Although I will say that those stone stripes do recall something much closer to home in this building. And Robert Venturi and Denise Scott Brown's Sainsbury wing at the National Gallery in London of 1991, unless represented a somewhat more mannered and less cartoon-like play on historical form, but in neither of these cases did the architects use historical form to create what in any way might be considered a traditional building. Quite the contrary. They saw the museums as very much of the late 20th century. It's just to them the spirit of the end of the 20th century, with modernism no longer new or revolutionary, called for some degree of looking back as well as looking forward, and embracing architectural history and making of it something of a collage. The sense of a collage or an assemblage represented a break from the modernist quest for a kind of pure ideal, a quest that I.M. Pei, as we will see, continued to pursue. Another factor, surely, in the rise of the museum was the arrival of a key figure in the architectural history of the museum at the end of the 20th century, whose impact now seems to be at least as significant as that of Louis Kahn and I.M. Pei, and that, of course, is Frank Gehry, whose Guggenheim in Bilbao, Spain of 1997 is without a doubt the key museum of the late 20th century. It's a building of great power, energy, and assertiveness, yet also of great beauty, and the curving titanium forms in combination with elements of stone and glass represented a truly new way of building that was less mannered than postmodernism, yet every bit as much of a break with classic modernism. And perhaps most relevant to what we're discussing right now, it became wildly popular. One of the few buildings of great architectural ambition, depth, and complexity to also excite the public imagination. There are not many such buildings in this category. In fact, I can really only think of a few beyond Frank Lloyd Wright's earlier Guggenheim, and those, in fact, are two works of I.M. Pei: the East Building of the National Gallery of Art in Washington and the Glass Pyramid at the Louvre, which have also managed to be worthy of extended critical analysis and inspire great popularity at the same time. Now, I said a few moments ago that the rise of the museum in our age was fueled, at least in part, by the democratization of art, by the presence of at least some degree of cultural literacy among a far broader swath of the population than ever before. But I have another theory as well as to what has been fueling the growth of the art museum, and it's this. Not only are there more relatively sophisticated people around, it's also the case that we now live in an age when so many people spend most of their days behind computer screens, dealing with virtual this and cyber that. And when you do that, you begin to cry out for the experience of authenticity. I believe that one reason there's so much interest in museums today comes down to that very fact, the power of authenticity. It is the fact that when you come to the art museum to see, whether it's an illuminated manuscript or an ancient carpet or a Rembrandt, it's real. When the current wave of technology made its way into our lives, there was a lot of fear it would have the opposite effect, that it would destroy the power of the real or at least diminish it. If you could see art on a computer, why bother go to the museum then? But of course, as we know, the opposite thing happened, that the real, by being more rare, became all the more precious. We know that authenticity in our age is no longer something that we can take for granted. We know that most of the visual images we see as we go about our lives today are not real, in the sense that the objects in this museum are real. And we value the authentic because we know it is so rare. The power of the real has grown. It is not diminished in our new technological environment. By the very fact of its being scarce, it takes on an almost holy aura. We are in the presence of the real thing, not the virtual image of it. And that aura extends to the very core of the museum's being. Another thing that has grown and not diminished in contemporary society today, both in the West and in the Middle East, this is also contrary to many predictions, is the value we place on good public space. Many of us spend a great deal of our time today alone, whether in office cubicles or cars or at home on computers, where we function as if we were alone, even if there are plenty of other people around. And of course, everyone has heard of the predictions of the demise of public space, of the end of town squares and stores and streets, and indeed of the obsolescence of the city itself. Who needs to be in a public place when you can do everything at home on your computer? Well, now, of course, we know that that prediction, too, was wildly exaggerated. Not because technology is not a very real and important force in the way we live, but because that prediction ignored a fundamental aspect of human character, which is that we do not want to be alone. People want to walk on streets as well as talk online. They want to be in real places. So to return to the question of the art museum, if you put these two phenomena together, the increased power of authenticity and the desire to be in a truly special public place, then suddenly the explosion of museums is not so much of a mystery. In truth, museums have become the most important public buildings of our time. They seem to embody our culture's ideals. And now again, we could cite that now common observation that they are in some ways the secular cathedrals of our time, repositories of the past, places that represent a set of shared values, and ways in which a place can assert its presence in the world. And when museums are complete, they function as community centers as well as places of enlightenment, just as cathedrals did. And they are places in which the very idea of immortality seems always to hover above us, as we hopefully might even experience some degree of transcendence from daily life. Now, I.M. Pei, of course, is not only an architect of museums, though museums have been in many ways the culminating projects of his life, a committed modernist who was born in China and educated in the United States. He began his career not as what we might call an artist architect, but paradoxically as the chief architect within the office of an important New York real estate developer William Zeckendorf, who in the early 1950s, when Pei was in his 30s, was eager to prove that it was possible to build commercial projects at large scale without sacrificing architectural quality. Pei shared both Zeckendorf's idealism and his pragmatism, and the developer convinced him to work directly for him rather than to open his own independent office. Now, it's worth mentioning this because this is not the sort of beginning one would expect for an architect who would eventually become one of the leading designers of museums in the world. Indeed, one whose practice would yield a building as significant as this one. But Pei was not a typical architect, as Zeckendorf was not a typical developer. Zeckendorf was genuinely excited by architecture and the possibilities modern design held in the post-war years. He envisioned himself less a conventional client than a true partner of his architect. The association with Zeckendorf lasted through the 1950s. In 1960, as Zeckendorf ran into financial problems that would eventually, sadly, result in his bankruptcy, Pei turned the large architectural department he had built for Zeckendorf into an independent firm, making himself perhaps the only architect in history to have had several dozen employees already the day he opened his own office. Now, Pei did many notable buildings for Zeckendorf, among them Kips Bay Plaza in New York, which you see now, or commercial towers like Mile High Center in Denver. They're elements of simple, direct geometries in most of these buildings, as well as a desire to move away from the plain, simple, transparent structures of the international style. And once Pei was on his own, he began to move even more assertively in these directions, beginning with the National Center for Atmospheric Research in Boulder, Colorado of 1967, a project that surely emerges out of a view of modernism as capable of possessing both traditional dignity and a whole new kind of sculptural energy. The influence of Le Corbusier is clear, as it is in the Luce Chapel in Taiwan, finished in 1963. More or less the same time, Pei also showed a willingness to learn from Frank Lloyd Wright, since the Newhouse Center for Communications at Syracuse University of 1964 clearly uses the aesthetic of Wright's prairie houses, but turns it into something very different, civic and monumental, and, most un-Wrightian of all, symmetrical. Now, there's no need to review Pei's entire career here, but it's important to note the way in which Pei looked at the entire range of modern architecture, treating it almost as if it were a vast smorgasbord, picking and choosing from a wide range of somewhat contradictory influences. He was seeking his own voice, but he hadn't fully found it yet. But what unites these early independent projects, as well as most of his work for Zeckendorf, was a desire to make modernism that was actively geometrical, yet solidly monumental. He had little interest in the notion of modernism as connoting lightness. If anything, his sensibility seemed more akin to the heavy, powerful style of late Le Corbusier that came to be known as brutalism. But Pei did something quite unusual, which is that he sought to make brutalism refined, to keep it heavy, but remove all its hard edges and make them smooth and elegant. These qualities would remain paramount in his work as he moved on to projects that we might consider precursors of the Museum of Islamic Art. Pei's first museums, the Everson Museum of Art in Syracuse of 1968, the additions to the Des Moines Art Center of 1968 also, and the Herbert F. Johnson Museum at Cornell University of 1973 are all different, yet each in its own way was an attempt to use blunt, direct, modern geometric forms to yield a powerful, yet at the same time highly refined building. Qualities that, of course, will not seem alien to anybody who's been looking around this building in which we sit. So too would Pei's other buildings explore different forms and influences, and yet, however varied, would always be defined by an exercise in geometric shape-making that was at once blunt and elegant. To stand for a large group of buildings designed at roughly the same time as this early museum's, let's look at just one. We'll use Pei's airline terminal at Kennedy Airport for National Airlines, a building that I show not only because it's always, to me, had great appeal, but also because it's in the news for an unfortunate reason, which is that it's being demolished by the airport management, which deemed it useless and out of date. We're not here to discuss modernist preservation problems in the United States, however, so let me go on to cite some critical buildings of Pei's early, middle, and late career that show the seeds of this building here in Doha and remind us that those seeds were planted early on. One of Pei's first independent commissions was that of the John F. Kennedy Library, originally planned for Cambridge, Massachusetts, but eventually built in a revised design in an outer section of Boston Harbor. Pei convinced the client to locate the library far away from the city at the farthest point on the site, far from other campus buildings, way out at the water's edge. Actually, even beyond a buildable portion of the site, so that a tremendous amount of site work was required before construction could begin. The final project is far from Pei's best building. There were more compromises than we could count. But it's very much a basic Pei composition made up of a circle, a square, and a triangle, with an elaborate glass space frame looking out onto the water and the view of the city skyline in the distance. The Kennedy Library project was begun in 1974 and not finished until 1979, despite the distance of 30 years between its completion and the opening of the Museum of Islamic Art, not to mention the enormous differences between these two buildings in terms of quality of materials and execution. It is not difficult to see that they at least represent a very similar attitude toward siting. In each case, the museum is envisioned as a fairly simple geometric composition set at the edge of the waterfront on a site created out of landfill specifically for this purpose, in conscious isolation from other buildings and the city center. Now, considerably more successful than the Kennedy Library was the East Building, Pei's addition to the National Gallery of Art in Washington, finished in 1978. Here, of course, there's no waterfront site, but the themes of Pei's earlier museums remain. The East Building is a solid masonry structure of crisp geometries, in this case dictated by two adjacent triangles with a large light-filled atrium in between them. The atrium's shape has always compromised this building somewhat functionally. The galleries are clearly secondary spaces organized around this spectacular room that is in every way the primary space of the building. It would be an exaggeration to refer to the galleries as leftover spaces, but it's still difficult not to feel that they are subordinate ones. Still, the East Building represented an important moment in the history of American museum architecture. Surely the most monumental modern museum built up to that point, and almost surely, even with its shortcomings, the most widely admired. Its success underscored the extent to which modernism had become an accepted, perhaps even conservative style by the end of the 1970s. Two other museum buildings, by Pei further set the stage for his work here at Doha. In 1989, Pei completed his glass pyramid that now serves as the public entrance to the Louvre. It's at this point surely his most famous work, and it's a project that was highly controversial when it was first proposed. Now it's become so widely accepted, it's difficult to understand why it ever provoked so much opposition. Though much of it, I think, was directed not toward Pei's actual design, but toward the very idea of expanding and modernizing the Louvre to accommodate larger crowds, of which the pyramid was only the most conspicuous symbol. Suffice it to say that for our purposes this evening, we can observe that Pei again uses modern elements and modern materials to create a simple, almost primal geometric shape, exquisitely detailed and absolute in its geometry. In a sense, then, this pyramid represents not a departure from Pei's previous work, but an extension of it. What marks it as different is the extent to which it relies upon and connects to older buildings. It can't be conceived as a thing unto itself, as most of his other buildings can be. Every image of the pyramid shows the Louvre behind it. The courtyard quite literally becomes part of Pei's architecture, and even from within. Now, if the Louvre showed that Pei could be more comfortable with classical symmetry than anyone had expected, further setting the stage in some ways for the Museum of Islamic Art, it provided another element that would prove beneficial in Doha. At the Louvre, Pei worked for the first time with Jean-Michel Wilmot, the gifted designer whose collaboration with him on interior exhibition spaces was so successful that the architect invited Wilmot to work with him again at the Museum of Islamic Art, where Wilmot would have a substantial effect on the exquisite design of the galleries. Pei was to design one other museum that might be said to serve as a precursor in a different way to the Museum of Islamic Art. It was, of all things, the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in Cleveland, Ohio, an unlikely project for Pei, who was given the commission in 1986, in large part because he was thought to bring an air of established respectability to a new institution that was largely associated with youth and irreverence. Pei characteristically immersed himself in the culture of rock and roll, even going so far as to travel to Memphis to visit Graceland, Elvis Presley's home, which he emphatically did not take as a direct architectural inspiration. In fact, this museum, which opened in 1995, ended up having many of the characteristic Pei elements: bold, dramatic shapes, and a large glass-enclosed central atrium. And, like the Kennedy Library and the Museum of Islamic Art, it had a prominent site along a waterfront. Now, by the time the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame opened, Pei was approaching the age of 80 and had largely withdrawn from his firm. He didn't retire. He formed a partnership with his two architect sons with the understanding that he would accept only those commissions that he deemed very meaningful to him. One was the Miho Museum outside of Kyoto, completed in 1997, which is reached via a dramatic approach through a tunnel and over a bridge, a clear effort to reinterpret classic Japanese design. Another was a museum for Shaozhou, Pei's family's ancestral home in China, which opened in 2006 and which represented a similar effort to integrate traditional Chinese architecture into what was clearly a modern building. Both of these buildings possessed many of Pei's characteristic elements, underscoring the fact that Pei had no desire to imitate a traditional building directly. His goal at Shaozhou was to create a modern building that would synthesize elements of traditional style and would appear sympathetic to traditional buildings while being very much of the 21st century. And this now brings us full circle back to this building for the ambition of creating a modern building that would synthesize elements of traditional architectural styles, as if to prove that modern and traditional architecture need not be seen as representing entirely opposite philosophies, precisely describes Pei's intentions for the Museum of Islamic Art, Pei's last major commission. This museum, a key building block in the program of the Emir, Sheikh Hamad bin Khalifa Al Thani, to establish Qatar as a major cultural center, and the first in the extraordinarily ambitious series of museums overseen by Sheikha Al Mayasa, actually began before Pei was called to design it. In 1997, an architectural competition was held to find a design, which was won by the Lebanese architect Rassam Boudran. Boudran's project did not go ahead, however, and Louis Monreal, a member of the competition jury, suggested to the Emir that the project might appeal to Pei, whose prestige, it probably did not have to be said, would bring welcome attention to the Emirates' already rapidly growing cultural stature. Pei agreed, despite the fact that he had never designed a building in the Middle East, or perhaps because of it, since he has said that, and I quote, "I enjoy doing buildings in places I've never been before. I enjoy learning about a place. I knew the East because I was born there, the West because I was educated there, but the Middle East I did not know." Pei was clear from the outset that he would try to do much the same thing that he had done in Kyoto and was in the process of doing in Suzhou. He wanted his building to stand as evidence that there need not be a contradiction between modernism and traditional culture, to show that it is possible to design a thoroughly modern building that absorbs and reflects the influences of traditional architecture. Islamic architecture, of course, is another thing from Asian architecture, as Pei freely admitted. He could not claim any real familiarity with it as he began the design process. His Western education had taught him nothing about either the art or the architecture of Islam. At the start of the design process for Pei, we might almost say that Islamic architecture was more analogous to the equally unfamiliar culture of rock and roll. But as he had done to prepare himself for the process of designing the building in Cleveland, Pei immersed himself in this new culture, sought to understand not only its physical forms, but also the minds of its creators. He began by reading a biography of the Prophet Muhammad. And then he began to travel across the region, seeking, he said, to discover the essence of Islamic architecture. It was an extraordinary journey, a gesture that underscored that the architect was anything but casual in his attitude toward this project. Pei went to see the Grand Mosque in Cordoba, Spain, which he later said he had previously assumed to be the high point of Islamic architecture, but which he now felt, after educating himself, was too Spanish, perhaps even too Mediterranean. Similarly, the Jama Masjid in India felt too Indian. The Umayyad Great Mosque in Damascus felt too suggestive to him of Roman and Byzantine architecture. Nothing Pei saw in the initial parts of his journey seemed to him to reveal the essential qualities of Islamic architecture as a pure thing unto itself. In Tunisia, Pei found himself more attracted to the ancient ribats or fortifications than to the mosques. In the forts, he said, sunlight brings to life powerful volumes, and geometry plays a central role. In time, Pei's travels took him to Cairo, where he visited the 9th century mosque of Ahmad ibn Tulun, the oldest mosque in Cairo to have survived intact. And there he found what he'd been looking for. If Cordoba, as Pei said, was too lush and colorful, Ibn Tulun was severe and simple in its design, a place where sunlight brings forms to life, in his words, an almost cubist expression of geometric progression from the octagon to the square and the square to the circle. The severe architecture comes to life, Pei said, in the sun with its shadows and shades of color. It's not difficult to see the connection between the high domed fountain in the central courtyard of Ibn Tulun and the museum Pei would come to build in Doha, just as it is easy to see the influence of the arcades facing the courtyard of Ibn Tulun Mosque and the arcades of the courtyard he would design in Doha between the main building of the museum and its education wing, where we will shortly have dinner. Pei's attraction to the mosque in Cairo was genuine and it ran deep. The sincerity of his quest for the essential qualities of Islamic architecture cannot be doubted, particularly not when one considers it part of a career of long studies Pei has made of contexts, both cultural and geographical, within which his works were to be placed. Still, it's true that every architect, like every artist of any type, sees what he wants to see. He or she sees what is relevant to the idea and sensibility that they bring to a situation. As Frank Gehring looked at Los Angeles and saw the energy of chaotic industrial sprawl, not the softness of pink Spanish Mediterranean houses. As Le Corbusier looked at pure architectural form against the landscape and saw not the architraves and entablatures of classicism, but the boldness of form, so I. M. Pei looked at Islamic architecture and saw its clear basic geometries, elements that connected to the aesthetic sensibility that he brought to his exploration. He did not see calligraphy or decoration or the ways that geometries are often used in Islamic architecture to create the finest, most delicate, and intricate patterns and ornaments. He once admitted to being even uncomfortable with those examples of Islamic architecture that were too dependent on calligraphy and ornament, those that depended, in other words, on the things that did not align with his own aesthetic. There's nothing wrong with this. As I've said, I believe that every artist must see what he or she wants to see. A selective reading of precedent is, in fact, one of the things that make possible the intervention of the new. My point is only to say that we must understand Pei's use of Islamic forms in this context, to know that his quest to seek the essence of Islamic architecture, while deeply earnest, was in every way colored by his lifelong preferences for Western modernism and his own reading of Western modernism as predominantly a composition of geometric forms and spatial volumes, not of decorative detail. We might contrast Pei's view of Islamic architectural tradition with that of Jean Nouvel, who also has a presence in Doha in the form of a new cylindrical tower, and who will eventually have an even more conspicuous presence through the new National Museum that is just now going into construction not far from this building. When Nouvel designed the Arab World Institute in Paris, he, like Pei, sought to evoke Islamic tradition within a modern context. But Nouvel saw precisely the opposite of what Pei saw. He saw not the solid, severe masonry forms, but the intricate ornament and the exquisite decorative patterns, which he thought to evoke in an entirely new way by making them the inspiration for an ingenious system of sunscreens. He put these Islamic-inspired sunscreens behind a glass curtain wall, which is about as distant from Islamic tradition as you can get. So it's not only Pei who seeks in Islamic precedent those elements that would allow him to make a work of architecture that is consistent with what he has done before. But this inevitably means, of course, that the elements of the Museum of Islamic Art that evoke Islamic precedent are somewhat limited and cannot be said to be entirely defining of the building as a whole. And in some cases, things that Pei has cited as Islamic are conditions that are not limited to Islamic architecture. For example, he speaks often and quite movingly of the way in which he was inspired by the way the forms and volumes of traditional Islamic architecture are brought to life by the intense sun, and said he envisioned his building also very much as a structure to be seen in bright sun, its crisp forms outlined against the blue sky. It's indeed so. But it's difficult to list this welcome but very general quality as evidence of a strong connection to Islamic tradition. It's first and foremost a modern building, albeit a modern building designed with great sympathy to and engagement with Islamic tradition. These connections to Pei's other work parallel and sometimes even overshadow his desire to respond to Islamic tradition. The choice of the museum's site is a good example. The building had been proposed for various sites along the Corniche, all of which Pei rejected, fearing that large structures might at some point overshadow the museum. He suggested instead this man-made island connected by landfill so that the museum might stand wholly apart and thus be seen against the water, not against other buildings. And thus the museum occupies this spectacular, even unique site, breathtakingly beautiful, but set apart with a formal axial approach, a siting that might in some ways seem to have more in common with the formal axes of Western buildings in the classical tradition than Islamic ones. Although I think it should be pointed out that the diagonal axis, which you see in this image, subtly but powerfully evokes the connection to modernism as well. While the Museum of Islamic Art is vastly grander and more thoughtfully conceived and executed in every way than the Kennedy Library, its siting on landfill, overlooking the water, and as far away as possible from other buildings, surely evokes that of the library, or to a lesser extent, the waterfront site of the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. Now, I will not describe the building in great detail tonight, since at this point I think I can truly say, look about you, knowing that almost everyone in this room has or will be about to spend much time in this building. But let me discuss just a couple of specific elements of this building and then conclude. This great central space is absolutely key to this building, as it is to almost every other Pei museum. There are elements here like the side staircase details and the great dependence on natural light that remind one of the atrium of the East Building of the National Gallery in Washington. The orientation to the water and the view, of course, evoke the Kennedy Library. As I've said, while the symmetry of the Great Hall is not characteristic of Pei, and neither for that matter is the dome or the fountain, one still has the sense that despite these factors, this space has more in common with other Pei work than not. It's a large, light-filled public space, defined largely by walls made of the same stone as we see on the exterior, with galleries arrayed around it. in spaces that are clearly subsidiary to the main hall. The dome, of course, is not typical of Pei's work, but neither is it what one would call a traditional Islamic dome either. If the fact of the dome is an acknowledgement of Islamic tradition, its specific design, with this interior of faceted stainless steel, is not, although it is unquestionably beautiful and eloquent as a way of mediating between Islamic tradition and modernist form, and of enhancing the play of light, which enters through a small oculus and then shimmers down as reflected by those facets. On the exterior of the building, the dome is, for all intents and purposes, non-existent, since it's surrounded by stone walls which combine to form a central tower, roughly square, that's the culminating element of the mounting sequence of masses that make up the overall volume of the building. The square tower is a dramatic break with the precedent of Ibn Tulun in Cairo, which inspires the stepped-up angular masses below, but which of course culminate in a very visible dome. Pei's decision to cover the dome is partly, I think, a response to scale. His dome is fairly small, more of a punctuation mark than anything else, not a dome that covers the full space. And if it were visible on the outside, it might seem underscaled, almost trivial. Still, these walls create a striking paradox. Pei has created a sense of false walls, indulging in the very sort of cover-up that modernists traditionally criticize as characteristic of historicist architecture. In other words, in search of the honest appearance of modernism, he's made his building less honest. Does this matter? I think not. I mention it not to be critical, but to point out the fallacy of so much modernist rhetoric. Pei is using a false tower as a kind of stage set here, denying the structural reality of the dome. But while this may seem to be a contradiction of modernist doctrine, it offers instead something more meaningful than rhetoric, which is an exterior that is whole and complete as a composition unto itself. Within the decision to shape the exterior this way and to not express the dome, there's an implicit admission that visual pleasure and ordered composition are more important than any false search for some alleged truth. Below the dome, the space becomes complex, and despite many elements that allude to Islamic decorative tradition, such as the patterns here on the floor, the octagonal fountain, and the exquisite filigree pattern of the chandelier above us, the overall sense is still of modernist space and structure. One of the most remarkable element of this building, is the unusual sequence of geometric forms within the structure by which the dome is supported, which Pei has described as a geometric matrix that transforms the dome from circle to octagon to square